I would like to make a statement about the appalling violence that took place during last week's protests outside Parliament. I want first to express my gratitude to those police officers and commanders who put themselves in harm's way. They showed great bravery and professionalism in the face of violence and provocation. It was this bravery that enabled this House to engage unhindered in democratic debate, and I know that the whole House will want to send them our thanks.
This had nothing to do with policing. This had everything to do, I think, with media management. Because if we stand back, at the time, the only people who were objecting systematically to the coalition government's programme of cuts were the student protesters. And the way in which you transform that debate from being about coalition cuts, what are you doing to our universities, what are you doing to higher education, into a debate that government knows it can win hands down, is to bill those protesters as being dangerous, subversive anarchists. And so by changing that narrative to being a discussion of what David Willits was and wasn't doing with university funding policy at the time, what we did instead was to say this is all about riot.
These student demonstrations were taking place in the context of a wider agenda of austerity. We knew at the time that more was coming. And so it was very important at the time for those in power, those that were going to be responsible, pushing through that very unpopular agenda of austerity, to make very clear that resistance to that agenda was not going to be tolerated.
Forward, and we will brutalise you, we will beat you up, and we will put you in prison. That's the message, isn't it? Blindingly obvious. That's what states do every time they're confronted with resistance.
The student demonstration on the 9th of December 2010 was called by the Education Activist Network alongside the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts and the UCU London region. It was called as a feeder march to the candlelight vigil which had been called by the official UCU trade union as well as the National Union of Students. Because of the massive build-up to the 9th of December, the vote on tuition fees, students and lecturers didn't think it simply was enough to just have a candlelight vigil to mourn the death of higher education, but ultimately wanted to set a sign to the government which was going to implement the trebling of tuition fees.
And people had a lot at stake. Like there were a lot of students there, kind of higher, like further education college students, sixth form students, who, people who were receiving EMA and stuff, and that was about to be cut. And if this bill goes through, this was people who, if the bill didn't go through, would be about to apply to university, and if it did, probably wouldn't be able to do that anymore.
You could sense that the whole atmosphere of the demo was completely different. Like, there was a lot more animosity, there was a lot more tension. The police numbers were a lot higher than anything that I've seen before or after.
I arrived just a couple of 100 meters away from here at Ulu, and it already was packed at 9 o'clock in the morning.
I say to those Lib Dem MPs, abstention's not enough when you promised opposition. And we say to this government, you may get the vote today, but this is not the end of our campaign, this is the beginning.
There was this common sense that you could feel between all of the students, that this wasn't a demo just about coming here, showing your indignation, shout a few chants and just go back home. There was this sense of actually fighting for change. And we didn't know how we were going to do it or in which form we were going to do it, but there was that common feeling that we just had to do it because this was our last chance, this was the vote day.
What really struck a chord was, like, we have a chance to defeat the coalition government.
Wow!
The students' movement and various organizations that organized the demonstration made it very clear from the start that we would assert a right to protest, which included the right to assemble in Parliament Square on the day that there would be the vote on tuition fees. The police denied us that right and barred us from entering Parliament Square, which we had warned the police of would result in a confrontation.
It didn't take too much, because as soon as people started to gather really close to the fences, and we saw the numbers, and it didn't take too long for people just started to take down some fences. And once the first fence came down, and that's when you can see that what the atmosphere was like. People just start storming into the square. That was not even a question of standing there and see what happens. You just go.
People wanted to get closer to the building because they wanted their voices to be heard. We were inside making the vote at the time on tripling the tuition fees to $9,000 a year. And yeah, people wanted to be heard. So they got closer and were making a lot of noise. People kept on getting pushed towards the rails, and the police would just smack them back.
All of the fences that were surrounding the square were now just being pushed forward. People were using it as shields against the police batons. There were the screen helmets that were being passed around to the people that were in the front in order for people to protect themselves from the batons. And the violence was just something unbelievable.
That was the moment at which the police had decided they were going to cordon off the square. And that's how we were then trapped. And that sense of not being talked to, not being given any information, not having been warned to start with, but not being given any sense of how long are we going to be here. I mean, ultimately we were there for over 8 hours. I think the kettle started about 3:15 to 3:30, that sort of time. And it was about 11:30 when finally I was released, and there were thousands of people behind me yet to be released. So we were there for a good long time, and it was incredibly cold.
I couldn't see any justification for pushing people back into the square and then keeping them there. It was simply pushing people back, with batons and shields and horses, in ways that seemed calculated, if not to goad people, at least to browbeat them. And people were not in the mood for this. This was a demonstration where people had come to try and persuade Parliament to not vote through what was a very reactionary piece of, not technical legislation, but to adopt a measure that would set in motion a really catastrophic change for public education, something that people felt very strongly about. And rather than be allowed simply to express that view and try and put some political pressure on Parliament, we were basically being pushed back and treated more or less like collective criminals.
You do that to people and people get pissed off. If you put anything in a cage, you trap anything and then prod it with a stick, it'll get annoyed, and that happened with a lot of protesters. You know, like kind of a lot of footage that came out in the news. It was after people had been trapped with no food, water, sanitation, and beaten like whenever they tried to get out.
There was a doctor on the 9th of December who set up an emergency field hospital in Parliament Square, and with 2 colleagues she treated up to 30 head injuries. And as well as that, you know, there were people lifting their wrists up trying to protect their heads, and you know, people had broken wrists that she treated. There was one young girl who suffered a broken collarbone from police charges. You have Alfie Meadows, who would have died essentially, and I know of one other case as well of a very young person who received bleeding on the brain.
It was probably the worst I've seen police behave at a demonstration. I mean, I think it's amazing that no one got killed that day, to be honest.
They didn't just kettle people on the 9th of December, you know, they tightened the space as well. They were essentially creating what could have been like a Hillsborough like tragedy, where they were containing people and pushing police lines so that people would be almost towards the end of the evening in smaller kettles, still having horse charges, but also then later kettling people on Westminster Bridge as well, in what can only be described as like a terrifying experience.
If memory serves me right, it was about 9:30 in the evening when the police had started to form this ring, come in across the square. Again, nothing was said or done, we weren't told anything, and we realised we were being forced and funneled across Westminster Bridge.
Once the police had everyone on the bridge, they just held people there. It was largely to demoralise people, like they were laughing at people and, you know, making jokes and things and just holding people there.
It's a spectacularly stupid way of policing anything. So I don't believe that it was about policing. This is a paramilitary activity. It's that old decision you're caught between. Either these people are deeply incompetent or policing wasn't what they were about in the first place. This was all about bullying and paramilitary activities.
You are going to kill people! You are going to kill people! There is no space! You are going to kill people! Translate that message! You are going to kill people! People are getting crushed! Please, just think of doing! You're not trying to be violent!
To get out, you had to go through a funnel of fully armoured riot police. On either side, they had the fit police cameras, again with bright lights and cameras in your face as you go down.
Violent disorder has been the predominant offence used against processes at the discretion of the police, because it's one of 5 public order offences. It's the second most serious, and by the police at their discretion charging students and protesters with that, they are inviting custodial sentences of up to 5 years.
The reaction to student demos, the policing on the student demos, the charges which followed really brought to the fore how much risk the right to protest is at present, particularly with the economic crisis and the austerity agenda. And as we've seen, this has been taken very seriously by activists, and we have, for example, the Defend the Right to Protest campaign that was set up in response to what happened on the student demonstrations.
Happy Meadows! Happy Meadows! We are all! 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 Happy Meadows!
The outrage that Alfie faces of having to go through the courts to defend himself, rather than being able to accuse the police who nearly killed him. What they're doing is trying to criminalise protest, to dissuade people from standing up against injustice. And that's why we're here today, to stand with Alfie, to show our solidarity with him, because he's representing all of us. But also we have to continue to demonstrate and to exert our right to protest, and that means supporting the strikes by teachers and university workers. It means demonstrating in support of those defending the NHS, and it means fighting back against all the cuts that this minority Conservative administration and the lying Liberal Democrats that support them are trying to push through.
It's an absolute injustice to rip young people away from their families, from their friends, from their education, for essentially protesting and protesting like they mean it.
The way to resist the attack on the right to protest is to protest. I think people have to continue going out on the streets. I think if you're to know your rights, to know your what to do if you're threatened with arrest or arrested, or to know what information you're required to give the police if the police ask you questions.
We have a sense that political protest isn't actually about taking a stand and holding your ground, but is about expressing an opinion or expressing a kind of sense of indignation, and that's not right. I mean, taking political action is not about expressing opinions. It's about relations of force and power around fundamental principles. For example, the fundamental principle that people have a right to higher education, to further education, to the education that they want and that they are suited to, and that is appropriate for their interests and for their desires, and that this is a fundamental right that we have, that we've fought to win, and that we have as a society, that we can afford as a society, and that we should defend as a society, and that it's about affirming that principle and then taking the action that's required to defend it and to sustain it against all the interests in society that are determined to subvert it, to block it, to turn it into an opportunity for profit.
I was just sitting here. They climbed all over my face, spit in my mouth, putting lipstick on my lips.